Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
And we're here today to give you a PESO for your thoughts, or take a PESO for our thoughts, or...
You and Martin Waxman need to hang out and work on your segues together.
Wow. That seems particularly harsh. I feel very bad for Martin because, I mean, my segues are just really, really painful.
His are pretty bad as well.
Well. Oh, well. What are you going to do? So, yes, we're going to, because there's nothing else going on in the world, we've decided that we're going to talk about whatever we feel like. And so last week we talked about my rebranding. And so this week we're going to talk about something near and dear to your heart because, you know, it's got to be an even trade, right? So we'll talk about the PESO model. And the PESO model, of course, is something that we've talked about before, but, you know, since we're in the midst of a new year, new beginnings, people have gone through 2020 and are saying to themselves, you know, what do I want to do differently? So maybe there's some people who are listening who are thinking about starting an agency today or pivoting their existing agency or who knows what. And so what I really wanted to focus on for this conversation was, if you were starting an agency today, does it have to be a PESO agency, or is there some other kind of agency that you can still build and be successful in 2021 and beyond?
It's an interesting question because obviously I believe in the PESO model.
That's a good thing because your life would be pretty darn miserable if you didn't.
Right. If I personally were starting my own agency right now, I would and this is personal because it's my core expertise and what I'm good at, I would create an agency that's focused, of course, on the PESO model, but internally our expertise would be owned media. And then we would bring in partners to do the shared, earned, and paid pieces of it. We would also sit at the center and make sure that it's all integrated and everybody's working together and, you know, it's all working the way it should. But for me if I were starting completely over or starting fresh, that's what I would do is I would hire people that had the content marketing expertise, and then I would partner with other agencies to do the other three media types.
Mm-hmm. And partnering agencies together is something that's become much more common. I mean, when I first got started in agencies 20 years ago, it was not unheard of, but it was much less common than it is today for agencies with different specialties and expertise to come together to work really collaboratively, not just because the client has hired you individually to do different components, but because perhaps you regularly work with certain partner agencies or you've got those kinds of relationships so that you're really delivering what the client needs in a much more integrated fashion without having to have all of the staff needed to do that at a robust level.
And I think it also provides an opportunity for you when you're accustomed to partnering with other agencies or other solopreneurs or other contractors, whatever happens to be, and the client has their own preferences. It's easy for you to sort of slide into that and say, okay, well, we can work with them. That's not a problem, you know, and you work with their ad agency and their digital agency or whatever happens to be. We have one client like that brought us in to do content, and they said, you know, we know that you already have sort of this structure set up, but we have an ad agency we really like. We have a digital firm we really like. We have some writers we really like. Would you consider working with them? And we were like, yeah. So and they actually said, wow, you really play nice in the Sandbox together.
Right.
But that's what it does, is it gives you that opportunity to not compete and to really do the best work for the client versus the best work that maybe makes more sense for your agency. Mm-hmm.
Well, a couple of things pop out from what you've just said, and the first is the playing nice in the sandbox. That's something that we've talked about repeatedly and how important that is, particularly as there are more partnerships going on, either by necessity or by strategy. And so, you know, finding ways to not treat every other agency that you come across in the course of a client engagement as the enemy, as someone that you're trying to steal business from, which, I mean, frankly, that happens a lot in the agency world where, you've got two agencies working on a project and one of them's always sitting there saying, geez, how can I get just a little bit more of the business? I mean, I've been in plenty of agencies over the years where that, we thought that way. You start to say, well, we're in here doing the crisis work, but could we take over some of the general brand communications, or vice versa? And so, those are things that, while it sounds good in the near term, it builds a bad reputation for your agency if you're always looked at as the person who's in there trying to undermine the other agencies that are working on that account. So first and foremost, absolutely learn to play nice in the sandbox. You'll get much further that way.
Much further that way.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Plus, it feels better. I mean, it feels kind of dirty going in there saying, I just want to steal someone else's business all the time. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But one of the other things that you talked about there was, if you started an agency, you would build a PESO agency focused on the O and having partners for a lot of the rest. I think that one of the things that agencies should understand, or really anyone who uses the PESO model needs to understand, is while O is probably the most common hub, and it's certainly what I would prefer as the hub, you can really come in from any point on the angle. So if you're a paid media firm, you still want to try to find ways to use the ASO as part of what you're doing in some fashion. So you don't have to think of it as you always start with one letter. It's not that way. It's really, how do you blend these things together in the right way to get the results that your client is looking for, which at the end of the day is what matters, right? You need to understand what the client is trying to achieve. And you shouldn't be sitting there saying, well, I have one way of doing things, and we're going to, engineer what the client is looking for into that. No, you actually need to listen to what the client wants and figure out not just how, but even if your services are the right fit for that client. Right. And the more that you're using the PESO model, the more likely it is that there is a piece for you in that.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. This actually came up in a conversation I was having. It was a webinar I did before the holidays, I don't remember now. But one of the questions from the audience was, if I'm using a PESO model program, where do I start? And like you, I think that if you're starting from scratch and the client has some specific goals in terms of awareness and search engine optimization and even driving marketing leads, then I think you start with owned. There are exceptions to every rule. And one of the things we talked about is you may actually start with paid, because the client's goals are to generate as many leads and conversions as possible. Right. And in that case, it doesn't make sense to spend all the time to build all this other stuff that has a longer tail. Maybe you start with the shorter tail, shorter term stuff, and then add in other things. So I think you're absolutely right. I would prefer it starts with owned, because I think that builds a nice foundation. But there are certainly times, a client our prospect may call you and say, we've got this huge event coming up and we really need to be in our local media in the next 3 months. Then you would start with earned. So I think it just depends on what it is they're trying to achieve, for sure.
Right. Well, and so I think that brings us to the question of, specialist agencies and how much can you specialize in your services? We've talked plenty about, the value of, finding some sort of a market niche, whether that's by industry or type of company or size of company or location or all that. But from a services perspective, how specialized can you be today? If you want to build a successful agency from scratch, can you be hyper-focused? Do you need to have PESO at your core? Do you just need to know where you fit into the PESO model so you can play nice in the sandbox? Do you need to have partnerships? I mean, what's your thinking about that and where PESO fits in from the specialization standpoint?
This answer sucks, but it
depends.
It is core to what we discuss all the time. It depends. For sure. There is something to be said 100% for having a focus. Yes, for sure. Typically, we see the focus in an industry or around a product or a service. That's typically what we see. I think the challenge with having a focus in one media type without bringing in the other media types is that it's challenging to get the kinds of results that you need to get and have a client feel like you're a partner in their growth by only doing one thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have paid, earned, shared, and owned inside your agency. But I do think it means that you need to have, maybe you have, like if we were doing it, our core expertise would be owned, and then we would bring in partners to do the other three media types. Same kind of thing. If your core expertise is paid or earned, then you have partner agencies or partner solopreneurs that can help you fulfill those other pieces.
But so I guess are you better off being really, really good at the P, the E, the S, or the O, or being pretty good at all of them? Which one is a more successful? And I mean, obviously, it depends. I mean, we can put that asterisk to absolutely everything that we say, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you rather be super expert in one of the letters, or just pretty good in all of them, so that you knew sort of how to pull it all together?
Okay, I think there are a few ways to approach this. Number one, if you're going to be very good at all four of them, your agency is big. It's a large agency. It's 50 employees or larger. So if you want to do that as a smaller agency, you probably have partner agencies, or you work with contractors or solopreneurs who have that expertise, and you're bringing that expertise into your agency. Where I think a PESO model led agency needs to focus is, we do one thing really well internally, and we also have a really deep understanding of how the other three media types work, so that we can make sure that not only is everybody doing what's best for the client, but it's integrated well and it's working together. And I'll give you a really good example. We have a huge client that we pretty much run, not pretty much, I serve as their chief content officer right now. And they've brought in a PR firm that's only focused on media relations, and they're having a really hard time with it because of everything that media is dissolving, there are roadblocks put up, like there's all these issues with just focusing on media relations, and they keep saying, well, can we do social? Can we do content? Can we? Which is what they should be doing. But the client already has those pieces handled by other agencies. So I think there's something to be said when you're starting a relationship to say, gosh, we're really great at media relations, but we believe in the PESO model, and so this is how we work. And then either you decide, is it a client that we want to take on and only do the media relations for because they have these other partners or they're doing it internally? Or do we say, no, that's not how we work, and then you pass on the opportunity? Mm-hmm.
So when you say that you have to be a big agency, 50 employees plus, in order to be, really an expert in all elements of PESO, I mean, that feels, I don't know, my initial reaction is that may be, I agree you can't do it as a one or twosie, right? I mean, none of us have the level of skill or the time needed to stay on top of all of the trends and be an expert in everything PESO at a high level. But couldn't you do it, as long as you had, one or two experts in each within your agency? I mean, couldn't you attain, real expertise in PESO at a much smaller level?
Yeah, I mean, yes, sure. I think you would probably need at least 10 employees to be able to do it and do it well. Mm-hmm. But you also are looking at a pretty high payroll because those people are going to be experts, right?
Yep.
So I will tell you from my own experience, it was really challenging for us to offer all four media types as one agency until we reached 30 people. We just, just from a payroll, from an HR, all those pieces, we just couldn't get there. Once we hit 30, that's when we started to be able to do it. That's not to say that you can't, and there are people out there who are considerably smarter than I am and probably can figure it out. But from my own experience, it took us 30 people to get there. Mm-hmm.
So how do you, if you're going to, acknowledge that you need to partner with people to be truly expert in delivering all elements of the PESO model to clients. How do you avoid falling into a trap where one partner becomes more dominant than the other, right? Where where you've sort of brought the people to the table, perhaps you're working together. Is there a risk that the client sees one of you as more important, or do you try to keep the partners behind the scenes? How would you structure that if you were creating your agency? How do you make sure that you're driving the ship initially and you don't lose control of it? Does that make sense?
It does.
Because I think that's one of the fears a lot of folks have when they start partnering with other agencies.
The way we handle it, and the way it typically works, it just sort of works this way, is that if I bring the business in, then I'm sort of the lead. If my paid media partner brings the business in, they're the lead. And it just naturally falls that way because they're typically the ones who have the relationship with the client. And so the client is always very happy to have the other expertise, but typically the agency that killed the business, who brought in the business,
right,
are the ones eating it, right? So they're going to bring in the partners to help fulfill it, but they're typically seen as the lead. Mm-hmm. That's just been in my own experience.
Now, how often have you been the agency brought in? Because that's, one of the things that I talk to a lot of agencies about, that, when they do subcontract work for other agencies, that often becomes a very difficult proposition, particularly financially, right? Because, if you've got a situation where one agency is the primary and then you're subbing it out, how does everybody get their margin and the client doesn't feel like they're getting ripped off? So, how do you look at it from that perspective, making sure that everybody's getting fairly compensated as part of this broader PESO approach? Or do you treat it as, if you're the primary and you're partnering with someone else, that you're not as worried about making as much margin on the piece of work that you're farming out, and really you're making your money off of the work you're doing and the strategic component and on all of that? How do you think about that?
It depends.
I mean, we'll record all of our podcasts now in 5 seconds. We'll just say, we'll ask the question. You'll say it depends. I'll say it depends, and we'll just wrap up. Yeah, we're all set. We're all set. And for those of you watching on video, you're enjoying seeing a cameo appearance by. Is it still Hope the hamster, or do we have a different name?
What's the hamster? It's still Hope.
Hope. Wow. Wow. I'm shocked. I'm shocked.
Yeah, still Hope, I guess. We're trying to think how to answer that. It really does depend, because in some cases, let me to step back. Do you agree with the premise that it can be difficult to figure out a financial arrangement that works for everybody? Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it depends. So we have one client that's a government agency, and they have a very specific way that you work, that you build, everything. And they have said, this is the maximum billing. We have to bill by the hour, which is crazy. But this is the maximum we'll pay you. So in that case, it's lower than my It's lower than my hourly rate, but then I get the markup on others who's higher than their normal hourly rate. So there's it kind of balances, actually more than balances out in that case. And then we have some clients that are like, how much does it cost? And we give them a scope of work and a cost, and they just pay it. And so I think it depends. It depends on the client. I think you have to be flexible. You have to have a good enough relationship with your partner agencies to be able to say, listen, this is what they're offering. I can't go higher. And I know that you normally, let's say it's $200 an hour and you normally pay bills $250. Do you want the work and we can figure all this out, but you're going to have a consistent paycheck every 2 weeks for the next 3 years? Or are you're not willing to take the cut on that because you're not willing to take the cut? So I think you have to have a good enough relationship to be able to have those really honest, transparent conversations.
Now, so what do you say to agencies that today are, they're ad agencies, they're media relations agencies, they're folks who are hyper specialized, and they say to you, look, Gini, PESO model's great. Yeah, the client should be thinking about it, but it's not my job to do all bits of this. And so, I still want to stay in my lane. It's what I do well. Clients like what I do. And so it's not on me to be thinking in a PESO mindset.
I think that's fair. I mean, I have had those conversations. Okay. I mean, just because I think that you should evolve your agency to do all of this doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case for everybody. Do I think that you will eventually have to? Yeah.
And that's really my question, right? I mean, do you think that? I mean, obviously, everybody gets to choose what they want to do, right? And none of us are in a position to tell everybody this is the right answer. It always does depend on so many different things. But it sounds like your core belief is that all agencies will need to evolve to this in some way in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think so. And, you and I both work with agency owners. And what I have found over the last 2 years is the agencies, and I know there are some exceptions to this rule, but the agencies that focus only on one thing are really having a hard time right now. They had a hard time last year. It has not changed. I don't think it's going to change for 2021. So I think if you have an opportunity to sit back and say, what do I want my agency to look like by 2022, and how are we going to continue to make money and grow? These are some of the things that you can consider.
Right. Well, I think that makes sense, and we certainly have seen. I mean, certainly, 2020 ad agencies in particular got just whacked with a 2x4. Others did as well, but in particular, I think that space has been especially harmed by the environment that we saw develop during the pandemic period. They're obviously beginning to recover, and I'm not saying that this is the death of advertising or anything like that. I'm not one of those insane people who says that this is the death of, I still remember the death of the press release so many years ago, and that whole hubbub, shall we say?
Yeah, there was a hubbub.
The kerfuffle over the death of the press release, and yet we still have press releases today. Obviously, they're different than they were 15 years ago, and they need to be different, and they're distributed differently, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But they're still not dead. Right. Radio, by the way, still not dead. Newspapers, still not dead. All these things that were supposed to be dead are not dead. Mm-hmm. So I would never be crazy enough to say something like that. But I think that the real virtue in the PESO model is it gives you an avenue to make sure that you're continuously delivering results for clients, which helps you build a more stable, growing business over time. Yes, it requires some more knowledge, some more expertise to some degree. You don't have to become, an absolute specialist. But, if you look at most agencies as sort of primary care physicians at base, they have to know enough about cardiology that they can have that conversation. Yep. And even if you're a cardiologist, you needed to know enough about, pulmonary stuff or neurology, so that where you have to go if you're not able to solve the problem yourself, right? So everybody needs to have some degree of knowledge of what's adjacent to them and how that fits in for the client, so that you can deliver the results. So I think the PESO model has to be something that you're comfortable with, familiar with. I think particularly for the folks we work with a lot, which tend to be sort of PR agencies and things like that, I think PR agencies absolutely need to lean very heavily into the PESO model, because if you're a traditional media relations firm, you need to have a hyper specialty to be successful. Today, I think generalist media relations firms are, generally speaking, having trouble. Yep. Anyway, you get the idea. Yeah. Right. So, but even with a hyper specialty, I think it's still so valuable to have, particularly the E and the O. The P, we can debate that a little bit, right? I mean, I still think there's a useful way to use it to amplify your earned media message. But certainly, if you're not using social to promote your earned media coverage with the client, that you're not collaborating with the client and their employees in order to be able to do that, you're missing the boat. And if you're not using OWN as a hub to help promote your, again, you're missing the boat. So you absolutely need to be using the PESO model if you're coming at this, I think, from a traditional PR agency perspective. You need to get much more heavily in. I think if you're, an SEO firm, a paid firm, a digital firm, those are pieces of it that you need, but it's not as urgent as it is for a traditional PR agency.
Totally agree. 100%. Yes.
So if you're starting an agency today, these are things that you need to be thinking about. Hopefully our 2 pesos have given you a little bit of an idea of how it can help. See, there's a terrible segue to get out of this.
I was trying. I wasn't going to say it.
Yeah, I don't even know what 2 pesos are worth. But anyway. So, on that note, we will wrap this up. Of course, if you want to learn more about the PESO model, where can you go to learn more about the PESO model, Gini?
Spinsucks.com.
There you go. A great location, a great resource. And of course, if you're not part of the Spin Sucks community, you should absolutely be joining that too, because next week we'll be getting back to questions that we come across in our work. And a lot of those come out of the Spin Sucks community because people ask great questions there. So if you want to be there to see the questions and the answers before we even have a chance to talk about them, and many that we don't even cover on this show, that's where you ought to be. So on that note, we will bring this episode to a close. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.